Everyone, by consulting the results of his intuition, can observe that the ego is given as producing its states. We undertake here a description of this transcendent ego, such as it reveals itself in intuition. We begin therefore with this undeniable fact. Each new state is fastened directly or indirectly by the quality to the ego as to its origin. This mode of creation is indeed a creation ex nihilo, in the sense that the state is not given as having formerly been in the me. Even if hatred is given as the actualization of a certain power of spite or hatred, it remains something new in relation to the power it actualizes. Thus, the unifying act of reflection fastens each new state in a very special way to the concrete totality, me. Reflection is not confined to apprehending the new state as attaching to this totality, as fusing with it. Reflection intends a relation which traverses time backwards and which gives the me as the source of the state. The same is true, naturally, for actions in relation to the I. As for qualities, although qualifying the me, they are not given as something by virtue of which the me exists, as is the case, for example, for an aggregate. Each stone, each brick exists through itself, and their aggregate exists by virtue of each of them. But on the contrary, the ego maintains its qualities through a genuine, continuous creation. Nevertheless, we do not finally apprehend the ego as a pure creative source beside the qualities. It does not seem to us that we could find a skeletal pole if we took away, one after the other, all the qualities. If the ego appears as beyond each quality, or even as beyond all qualities, this is because the ego is opaque like an object. We would have to undertake an infinite plundering in order to take away all its powers, and at the end of this plundering, nothing would remain. The ego would have vanished. The ego is the creator of its states and sustains its qualities in existence by a sort of preserving spontaneity. We must not confuse this creative or preserving spontaneity with responsibility, capital R, which is a special case of creative production on the part of the ego. It would be interesting to study the diverse types of progression from the ego to its states. Most of the time, the progression involved is magical, at other times it may be rational, in the case of reflective will, for example. But always there is a ground of unintelligibility, for which we shall give the reason later. According to different consciousnesses, pre-logical, childish, schizophrenic, logical, etc., the nuance of creation varies, but always it remains a poetic production. A very peculiar case of considerable interest is that of psychoses of influence. What does the sick man mean by these words? They make me have evil thoughts. We shall attempt a study of this in another work. Let us remark here, however, that the spontaneity of the ego is not negated. It is in some way spellbound, but it remains. But this spontaneity must not be confused with the spontaneity of consciousness. Indeed, the ego, being an object, is passive. It is a question, therefore, of a pseudo-spontaneity, which is suitably symbolized by the spurting of a spring, a geyser, etc. This is to say that we are dealing here with a semblance only. Genuine spontaneity must be perfectly clear. It is what it produces and can be nothing else. If it were tied synthetically to something other than itself, it would in fact embrace some obscurity, and even a certain passivity in the transformation. Indeed, it would be necessary to admit a passage from itself to something else, which would presuppose that spontaneity escapes from itself. The spontaneity of the ego does escape from itself, since the hatred of the ego, although unable to exist quite by itself, possesses in spite of everything a certain independence with respect to the ego, so that the ego is always surpassed by what it produces, although from another point of view it is what it produces. Hence the classic surprises, I could do that, etc. Here, evidently, the concrete totality of the me, intuited up to this time, weighs down a productive I and holds it back a little from what the I has just produced. The linkage of the ego to its states remains, therefore, an unintelligible spontaneity. This is the spontaneity described by Bergson in Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, which he took for freedom, without realizing that he was describing an object rather than a consciousness, and that the union posited is perfectly irrational because the producer is passive with respect to the created thing.